Well, I'm just glad that you are all here this morning. We're going to continue through the series that we're in, going through the book of Exodus. So hopefully it's been bringing some new stuff to life to you. And I just love the Old Testament because it's so narrative driven. You get to see the heart of God through this story, which really this story that we see throughout the entire biblical narrative, we see it in such a tangible way in the book of Exodus. And so today, I really want to paint a picture for us all, really this grander story that we see throughout the Bible, which is really our story too. It's not just a story, it is our story. But then we see the entire story all seen in the book of Exodus. So hopefully I can paint that for us today. But, let me just put up really quick where we're headed this morning. I'd like to do this for us so you get a picture of where this sermon is going. And so we all kind of are able to wrap our minds around where we're headed. So here's the big point for today for us all as we move through this. So nothing on earth compares to the presence of God in our life. But despite it, we have rebelled against the holy, good, and mighty God. But even in our sin, God moves towards us again, abounding in steadfast love, faithfulness, grace, which is entirely made known by Jesus. That's where we're headed this morning. So let me give you part one of this grander story, which is seen in the book of Exodus, which is part one is God's kindness and mercy. And this is what we have been focusing on from week one when we opened up the book of Exodus all the way up until today, which was just part one of this bigger story, which is God's kindness and mercy. That God is gracious, He's kind, He is good. He is a good God that moves towards His people. He saves and delivers them and gives them the one thing that their heart actually needs, which is Himself. So here's a quick Exodus recap, those of you who might be a little lost or newer, or maybe you've missed a couple of the weeks. So here's the Exodus recap, is that Israel is in slavery and bondage under Pharaoh. God hears the cry of Israel. He then calls Moses to go and deliver them. And then to show who He is, His power and might, He sends 10 plagues on Egypt. Then the people are delivered from Egypt out of into the wilderness. And then they cross the Red Sea, if you remember that. And as they cross, they see God's mighty power and His faithfulness. The water swallows up the Egyptian army. And then they're on the other side of the sea, and all of Israel celebrates. They celebrate this. And then we see God's provision in the wilderness. He sends manna and quail are dropping from the sky. Whenever they want to eat, they can pick it up and eat. Even though they're grumbling along the way, God still provides. And then He makes this covenant with His people, which we looked at last week where Jacob talked about the 10 commandments. He makes this covenant with His people and gives them laws and ways to live because they had been shaped under a pagan worldview and system in Egypt. And now they needed this new way of how do we live righteously under God. So He begins to give them these laws that shape them and gives them the 10 commandments. Then they enter into this covenant with one another, and everyone says, I do, and then they move forward. And so then Moses then returns back up to the mountain, and he receives more laws to shape the people, and all the people are down below waiting on Moses to come back with even more of the instructions from God on how to live, and that's where we pick up. And so really the bedrock of this entire story is God, and God in His kindness, His mercy, He initiates movement towards His people. Even though they don't necessarily deserve it, He hears their cries and He initiates movement towards them and saves them and delivers them and provides for them. That's the bedrock. And He gives them what they actually need most, which is Himself. And this is what we have been talking about all the way up until this point, up until this sermon, which is part one of the bigger story is just God's kindness and mercy. And so that leads us to part two of the story, which we're going to pick up this morning. And part two of the story is rebellion. That's part two of this bigger story. It's our story. It's the biblical narrative. But it's also all seen packed in the book of Exodus as rebellion. And most of us, because we're Americans, the idea of rebellion, sometimes we like it. We're all Star Wars fans, at least the nerds of us are, right? We like Star Wars. And there's this idea of rebellion, which is like good versus evil, which is like how can we take up against this tyrannical leader and the forces of good? And, this whole idea of rebellion sometimes sounds really right. Like we got to fight against the man, and there's something oppressing us, and we have to rebel against us. And so something inside of us says that we need to rebel. And the people of Israel, you see that as well, that there's this rebellion from this good and gracious God, although God is not Darth Vader in the story. He is this good and perfect God who initiates kindness, mercy, and grace towards his people. And so what's heartbreaking in this story is that our rebellion is not against a tyrant, but against a good and gracious king. And we actually rebel from freedom to slavery. And we're rebelling against what we were actually designed for, what our hearts really crave but can't ever seem to find outside of the love and graciousness and mercy of God. And so this is where we'll pick the story up in Exodus chapter 32. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, so remember, he goes back up to the mountain to receive more laws that are going to help shape the people of Israel. And so there's a little stressor here. They're waiting on Moses, but he's not returning, so they're feeling a little antsy. The people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. He's been up on the mountain too long," right? So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. This is rebellion against God. These are the freed people that God brought them up out of the land of Egypt. And here they're saying, like, there's this stressing moment, and what sounds right, there's this like little twist of truth there, because what sounds right is that here is the God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. This is the language that they had used, and now they replace it for a golden calf. So even though the language sounds right, they're worshiping this false God. And he's the one who freed them. He freed the people. He's new every day. He provided for all their needs when they were in the wilderness, and he had this mercy despite all their grumblings as they were traveling along. And so this moment of stress, Moses is up on the mountain too long. They freak out, and they run back to what used to enslave them, is what they did. So if you were here on week 2 or 3 when we went over the plagues of Egypt, we didn't cover the 5th plague, which was the plague against the livestock. Now, in the 5th plague, God showed his power by destroying all the livestock that Egypt had. One, because they had all these other gods. There was the gods over the Nile. There was the gods over the economy. There was the gods over the sun. All these things. And one of the gods was this god called Apis. And it was this golden cow in which Egypt worshipped. And it was the god over all the livestock that provided for them. And so one of the plagues was God showing his might by destroying the god that they worshipped, was this little golden calf god. And what he really showed was this was no God at all. The God who could not save you from Egypt was no God, this golden calf. This was only a familiar comfort to the people of Israel, that they remembered that this golden calf God they would worship provided for them through livestock. And so they went back to what was familiar. How offensive is this to the God of the universe? I destroyed that God that you all worshiped and showed he had zero power, that I had all the power. So in this moment where Israel gets stressed, they end up rebelling against God, and they begin worshiping this false God. And because rebellion actually makes you act like a fool, And it sends you worshiping things that cannot save you. It makes you end up looking like a fool in the eyes of God because it sends you worshiping things that cannot deliver you or provide you freedom or give you the things that your heart actually desires. And remember, this is not a story in the Bible. This is our story as well as humanity today. This is our story. We want all of God's stuff, his provision, but sometimes we don't want God himself. Because often we think we're smarter than God. You know, I'm an adult. The rise of the autonomous being, like, I don't need a babysitter. I'm an adult. I know how to get through life. And we fail to acknowledge the thousands of mercies that God has before us. And so we start saying these crazy things, just like Israel said, where they said, behold, the God that delivered you out of Egypt. And there's this golden calf in front of them. And so we start saying these crazy things. It says, behold, the God that delivered me from loneliness, which is my boyfriend or my girlfriend. Or behold, the God that gave me satisfaction in life, which is maybe possessions. Behold this God. Oh, finally I feel full. And behold the God that whatever X, Y, Z. We begin saying these crazy things in our life that this is what I truly want. This is what I truly long for. This is what I truly desire. And we end up saying these things, and our life reflects these things that behold the God that delivered me from whatever. And we can say those things as well. And we end up ascribing divine attributes to really earthly things. And then look how Aaron responds. And because Aaron sinned, and the people with Aaron, all the Israelites sinned in this moment. This was not okay of what they did. And so the Bible tells us that your sin will find you out ultimately. That it will expose you. The cross exposes us from our sin. And the Bible says that your sin will find you out. And it's in God's mercy and wrath in which he exposes your sin, whether it be privately or publicly. And your sin will find you out. And so God's divine love exposes people. And he exposes Aaron here in verse 21. And Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them? And Aaron said, let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So I said to them, let any of you who have gold take it off. So they gave it to me. I threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. It's one of those moments in the Bible you have to laugh because you might start crying if you don't, because it's so altered from reality. He's confronted with his sin, and the first thing he does, what does he do? He blames others. He said, it was the people that made me do it. And the impulse to convince ourselves that we're right and good is a powerful force inside of you. It is a powerful force. The impulse to say that I'm right and good and someone else is wrong. And we see this right here. When we get exposed for the frauds that we are in our life, from our behavior, Aaron is exposed here. We see this all the time in relationships, young or old, right? They made me do it. It was her fault. It was his fault. Or if you have children, you know that like someone gets pushed over and then for being pushed over, they then kick them or whatever, right? And it's like, well, they made me do it. They pushed me first, right? Like we see that all the time. And we will be sinned against by other people. Others and those closest to you will be the ones who their sin is most oftentimes presented to you. But your response is all up to you. And Aaron's response here was all up to him. And responding sin for sin is never in God's eyes like, oh yeah, I get that. Makes sense to me. They pushed you. You got to push them back. I get it. I understand. In God's eyes, he's never okay with that. And so the second thing here is that what Aaron does is he seeks to justify his actions. So first he blames, and then he looks to justify. And the reality distortion in this story is crazy, is it not? It's crazy. And the impulse also inside of us to convince ourselves that we are right and true and good to justify our actions can trump reality. And despite all the evidence that someone may have done something, despite all of that, the reality distortion kicks in. And what does Aaron do? He says, you know that these people are crazy, Moses. Israel, you know they're crazy people. And there's this large crowd, and they were all coming at me, and they had questions, and they had thoughts, and they were shouting things, and it's like, you know, and you were up on the mountain. You took longer than you said you would. And then out came this golden calf. Like, the reality distortion to justify our actions is profound. It's a powerful force that presses against our own righteousness that we're trying to live in, that God asks us to do. And that's what we do oftentimes. When you get this stressor in life, like the people of Israel, it's most easy to blame someone else for it. And it's most easy to justify the actions for it. And it's easy to say, I did everything right, and everyone else did something wrong. That the whole universe is against me. That we love to blame, we love to justify, and this is rebellion against God. So then that leads us to part 3 of this bigger story, which is God's wrath. And so God's goodness is moving and initiating towards his people. Even though they never deserved it, he initiates movement towards them. And then even though in his kindness and goodness, there's this rebelling. So then what's God's response to rebelling? God's response is wrath. So here's verse 7 of 32. And the Lord said to Moses, go down for your people. So we're going to back up just a little bit in the story. Go down for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I have commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them in order that I may make a great nation of you. Now, here's the way that we can think of this that might put it in like a little bit easier terms of what actually just happened here. Israel, prior to this, entered into a covenant, this covenant relationship with the God of the universe, where everyone stood on the altar and said, I do. And while on their honeymoon, Israel found another man and defiled the wedding bed while on the honeymoon. And let me tell you, God's response was not cool. He was not cool with it. This was not like, I get it. Yeah, sometimes we like to have fun while we're on our honeymoons. He was not okay with it. He was not good. And this is the wrath of God that we begin to see. Because God hates sin. He hates it. He is not indifferent towards it. Little, tiny ones, or big ones. He is not indifferent towards sin. And the effects of sin is not just on the individual, but we see that it's on generations and generations of what sin can do. And God is not cool. He is not understanding against rebellion or sin. He hates sin. And he says that he will destroy sin, and soon, once and for all, he will do that later in the biblical story. But sin, it rots our soul. Like Billy Graham used to say, sin is a disease. And sin rots your soul. It rots your families. It rots generations. It rots communities and states and nations. And ultimately, sin rots the world at its core. And God hates it. There's nothing about it that he thinks is okay or I understand. And this rebellion against God and the life and the freedom that God has, it leaves decay and death when sin is present. And so the wrath of God is right and just to burn hot against not just Israel's sin, but all sin. Let me give you a picture of what this sin is like. There's this disease in trees called heart rot. Anyone ever heard of that? This is not me making it up. This is just a provision of the Lord right here, all right? It's called heart rot in trees. And so what happens is on these big hardwood trees, there's this fungal disease that actually implants in the middle of the tree. And so on the outside of the tree, it looks really wonderful. There's a nice hardy bark, and even like the ring around it, if you were to slice it in half, looks like good and healthy. But on the middle here, you'll see what you can't see here, or what you can see is there's like this fungus in the middle of the tree. And this fungus from the middle of the tree rots it. And so even though on the outside you can see it looks healthy, the picture of this stump, it looks healthy on the outside, but in the middle there's this massive disease, and it's called heart rot in trees. And so what ends up happening is there might be this big, massive tree that you would need a team of people, chainsaws, big trucks to get it out and whatnot. That when heart rot takes root in a tree, and once it has its full effect, a normal-sized man could go and push over a massive tree. That's what heart rot is. And that's what sin is like in our life. That on the exterior, everything might look fine. On the interior, you are rotting at your core. Is this not Spokane? Is this not our nation, our world? That we put off this fake self, that on the exterior, it all looks right and good. On the outside, it looks like you have it all together. And the projection of strength is not always good. Oftentimes, the projection of strength is heart rot, what we've been taught to do. And then all of a sudden, this mighty tree falls over. And it's like, what happened to that person? What happened to that marriage? What happened to this relationship or this business or whatever it may be? And it just crashes over. And then the effects of it just, boom, ripples out for families, generations, time to come. The collateral damage of heart rot is significant. And the wrath of God, what we oftentimes think when we say like the wrath of God is like, is God going to like strike me with a lightning bolt? Like I'm just going to be walking down the street and I sinned the other day and God's really mad at me and then just boom, you're just dead. That is not the wrath of God. Yes, you've seen that a few times in the Bible, but those are more singular events that take place. The wrath of God, we'll see what it is in just a moment here in Exodus, but Paul in Romans chapter 1 describes what the wrath of God is. And so feel free to look that up anytime during this sermon or afterwards. You can see what Paul says. Here is the wrath of God. And what Romans 1 tells us is that the wrath of God says that he just turns us over to what we're chasing. That's the wrath of God. That if you're chasing women, he'll just turn you over to that and let your life play its course out. The wrath of God says if you're chasing success and possessions and all these other things in life, he'll just turn you over to that. He'll turn you over into your sin, and you'll get your sin, you'll get what you want, but you will not get him. The wrath of God is that. And what the wrath of God does is it allows us to end up being hollowed out like heart rot. That is what the wrath of God is. And so there's God's kindness, then there's the rebellion, and then there's the wrath because of the rebellion, and then that leads us to the fourth part of the story, which is atonement. This is the fourth part of this bigger story of the Bible. It's our story as humanity, and it's the story we see in Exodus as well. And so in chapter 32, verse 30, the next day Moses said to the people, so he's like, Aaron, what have you done? You guys just defiled the covenant. We said I do. And Aaron's like, out came the calf, right? So then this is what happens. The next day, Moses said to the people, you have sinned a great sin. And now I will go up to the Lord, and perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. And so God, yet again, even in the midst of his kindness and his wrath burning hot, just wanting to turn his people over into their sinful ways, he moves towards his people and initiates movement towards them. And here's what atonement is. Atonement is the paying the ransom for something is what atonement is. That there is a price to be paid ransom for a person's life. And so when Moses is going up, he's going, your life now is in jeopardy. And I'm going to go up and see if I can pay ransom for the price over your head. And we'll see if that can work out. The atonement is the paying the ransom for. And so Moses goes up, and he pleads with God. And he says to God, remember the promises that you made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember this. Can you forgive this sin? Can we make atonement for this sin? Can we pay the ransom for this? And so then we see that God's relenting is really just a picture of what's soon to come in Jesus. And because Moses cannot make atonement because he is a sinner. You would need a perfect, spotless sacrifice. And so Moses ascending up onto this mountain or this hill, pleading for atonement, he cannot be done. Moses cannot do that. And because Moses going up onto this mountain is a lesser picture of the real greater Moses, who is Jesus, to come, that really makes atonement once and for all, and he pays the ransom for the world. All your sin, past, present, future, was taken care of on the cross. Those that have faith in the one to come, even before the book of Exodus, their sin was paid for, and those after. Abraham was counted as righteous by faith, by belief in that one day someone might come, a Savior. Abraham was counted as righteous because he had faith in what might happen. And so when Jesus died on the cross, that faith that Abraham had back in the book of Genesis, he was counted as righteous because of his faith. And just a glimpse, this tiny sliver of picture of what might come one day. And you know what? We have the entire story now. He just had a glimmer of what might happen, and he was counted as righteous because of his faith. That when Jesus died on the cross, the sin past, present, and future of humanity who places their belief and faith in him was paid for. So then we go down to Exodus chapter 33, verse 1. So the Lord said to Moses, "Depart and go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, to the land in which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey," because they're searching for the promised land right now, and they're waiting to go to it, flowing with milk and honey, "but I will not go among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." And when the people heard this is really important here, when the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments. For the Lord had said to Moses, "Say to the people of Israel, you are a stiff-necked people. If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you or destroy you. So now take off your ornaments, that I may know what to do with you." Therefore the people of Israel stripped themselves of the ornaments from Mount Horeb onward. Here's what God is saying here. He tells Moses, when Moses goes and pleads, he says, you know what? He's showing the wrath of God here. He's saying, you want the promised land. You want the land flowing with milk and honey, and you know there's all these enemies, the Canaanites and the Jebusites, all these people. And you know what? I'm not going to go there, but I'm going to send one of my angels there because I don't want to go with you. And you know what? You can have the land of milk and honey. All your enemies will be defeated. Go and have what you want, but I'm not going with you. And the people mourned because of this. That you won't have any enemies. You will have wealth. You will have prosperity, but you don't get me. And the people mourned. And then we see in verses 7 through 11 here that Moses meets with God in the tent of meeting. And when Moses would go into the tent of meeting, this big cloud would come down, and it represented God's presence. And it would settle over the tent of meeting. And all the people of Israel would see this great cloud. And what they would do is they would go back into their tents or stand right outside of their tents, and they would worship. Because they would see God's presence was with them. They felt comfort by it. They loved this, that God was there and with them. They felt safe, but now they wept. They wept from what took place. When I was a kid, anyone in here was afraid of the dark when they were a kid? You can raise your hands. That's okay. We don't judge you. You're adults now. No one's afraid of the dark anymore. I was afraid of the dark as a kid, probably like many of you. And, your parents go and they put you to bed, and then you're in this dark room alone. And you know what? I kept this little fishing knife with a little green handle in my top drawer just in case a burglar wanted to come in and get some, all right? And that's where I kept it. But then, like, when the door's shut, but then there's this little strip of light underneath the door. You know what I'm talking about? And that little strip of light under the door, you know what that represents? That represents that mom and dad are still awake. And they're out there. And someone more powerful than you is there protecting you. Someone more that's stronger than you is providing this presence of safety, which allows you then to go like, okay, there's this strip of light, I can go to bed. Even though it's dark inside my room, I know that there's this strip of light here and I can feel protected. And this was like the cloud. This was God's presence to the people of Israel. They felt safe and protected. And when God said, you can go and have what you want, I'm not going with you, they wept because that little light was going to go out. And they didn't want that. The light under the door resembles safety, even though there's darkness. And this is the sign of God's presence that he's saying, it's gone. That is God's wrath. Go and have what you want, but you don't get me. You can have what you think you want, but you don't get me. And one way we know that God is powerful and glorious is that he is better than everything. He is better than anything you can have in this world. That he's saying you can go and I'll wipe out all your enemies. You'll actually have a peaceful place to live, but you don't get me. We have peace not because we lack enemies. We have peace not because we lack troubles in our life. We have peace because the power and presence of God is with us no matter where we go. And this is why Jesus taught in Mark 8:36, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? This is how Jesus taught this very thing. You can just go to the store and open up a People magazine. And you can see people with wealth beyond imagination, but completely destroyed lives. That if we get everything we want and we don't have God, we have lost everything. And that is the wrath of God. Have what you want, but you don't get me. And so Moses argues back. He's like, we're mourning. This is not okay. We have to have you. And he said, I'm not going to go with you and you don't get me. So this is what Moses says in Exodus 33:16. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? What makes us distinct among everyone else is God. What makes us distinct as a community of believers is not that we just come in a room and meet. What makes us distinct is not that we have our own worship songs or our own hymns that people have written. What makes us distinct is not that we try and live good and moral lives. What makes us distinct is not that maybe some of the choices we make lead to success or healthy relationships. What makes us distinct as a people group is God himself indwelling his power and presence in our lives. That is the distinctive factor of Christianity, is that God indwelling himself among his people. And Moses says, we will be no longer a distinct nation if we don't have you. What makes us distinct among people is God. It's not that we get everything we want. It's in God's presence that we are made distinct. So what does this look like? One is, I think distinction happens miraculously and in a moment when you say yes to Jesus, that the old life is gone and the new life has come. There's this distinctive mark that's been placed the moment you place your faith in Jesus. But more importantly, the distinction works itself out over a long period of time of everyday faithfulness. That's what's called sanctification. That God sanctifies us over a long period of time of everyday faithfulness. Now, some of you may have known just a lovely gentleman in our church named Larry or Lyle Enlow. He was the man that walked around with the oxygen tank. I recently just performed his funeral just on last Friday and had permission to share this with you. Just a lovely soul. Any of you who would have known Larry was just an amazing man. Always encouraging people, always just happy and upbeat to be at church. And you know, Larry was not a perfect man. He was a man with brokenness and mistakes, and he came to Jesus later in his life. But then he began to live this everyday faithfulness that made his life distinct from what you might see from others. And when I sat with him in his hospice room a few days before he passed, and I asked him, you know, Larry, are you ready to go be with Jesus? Now, I have done that other times before, and the variety of responses you get when someone is on their deathbed is pretty, wide. And Larry, with like a tear in his eye, was genuinely saying, I cannot wait to go and be with Jesus. The distinctive mark on his life was everyday faithfulness of, yes, you fail, and you get back up. You fail again, you get back up. Everyday faithful, praying for miraculous breakthrough leads us to this distinctive life because God is with us. So then Moses says to God, show me your glory. And God says to Moses, you cannot see me and live, but I will let my goodness pass before you, and I will pronounce my name to you, and I'm going to hide you in the cleft of a rock. I'm going to put you in a cave because you cannot see me and live, but I'll just let my goodness pass by you, and I'll give you my name. And what a name is in the Bible is like a resume. Who is this person? This person, son of this person, son of this person. It's a resume of your life, your character, your integrity, and who you are. So then in Exodus 34, 4-7, the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there, and he proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. What we see here is the tension is real, that God is saying, my name, who I am, means that I have steadfast love forever, yet by no means will I just let sin go. And so the good passes by Moses, that he is this God of mercy. And he does not give his children the punishment that they deserve. It's this steadfast love, abounding in grace. He's slow to anger, and he's abounding in the steadfast love and faithfulness, forgiving transgressions and sins of thousands and thousands, but by no means clearing the guilty, because God hates sin. He never thinks it's cute. Then we see in verses 10 through 35 that God re-enters this covenant with his people. And then we see in the rest of the Old Testament that he forgives sin and he punishes sin because he destroys it. And so how can this holy God that no one can even see come and be among his people, that we might see the face of God and live in this righteousness? This is what John tells us of his gospel account of Jesus in chapter 1, verse 17. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Here's how the NLT states it, which I like it as well. For the law was given through Moses, but God's unfailing love and faithfulness came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the unique one, who is Jesus, who is himself God, is near to the Father's heart. He has revealed God to us. So now we get to look Jesus face to face one day and see the glory of God represented in Jesus and the coming of him. And now we have this new and everlasting covenant that Jesus made through his life, death, and resurrection. Because the veil of the temple was torn, if you remember that last week from Jacob, because now God no longer resides in a building, but he resides in you and me. And this everlasting covenant has been entirely and fully made known by Jesus. That one day we might be resurrected in his life and marked by God and live with him forever. Because Moses ascended that hill and tried to plead for atonement and a price that he could not pay, and the sacrifice that was needed. But it was then by Jesus ascending his hill with a cross on his back, and that he was nailed to it, he died on it, but then he was put in a grave and he was resurrected to new life, that the final atonement, the price that was to be paid for your ransom, my ransom, and the ransom of the entire biblical account and all of humanity, was finally paid for. And so this is why it means that nothing on earth compares to the presence of God in our life. But despite it, we've still rebelled against the holy, good, and mighty God. And even in our sin, God still moves to us. And he's abounding in steadfast love, faithfulness, and grace, which is entirely made known to you and me by Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection. So don't ever think that God's mercy is not enough for you. That our story is the story we see in Exodus, which is God's kindness and mercy is initiating towards you. That we've rebelled against God, and God is rightful in his wrath to let you leave in your sin, but God paid for that through the atoning sacrifice of Jesus, and you now have access to this full everlasting covenant that you live in this new life with him. That is really good news. That is their story, and that is our story today. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for this everlasting covenant. Lord, how we need you. God, we rebel against you every day, and you are right to turn us over in your wrath. Yet you are abounding in love. You are full of grace, and that one day you will destroy sin once and for all through the second coming of Jesus. Lord, might we live distinct lives. Nothing on earth compares to you. No achievement, no person, no relationship. Nothing compares to you. And without you, we have nothing. And so thank you for your grace. Thank you for your faithfulness. Lord, we love you. Fill us today with a fresh sense of your abounding grace and mercy. And we pray this in your name.